5. Evolution of the Jewish problem in the 19th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, the immense majority of Jews was concentrated in the backward countries of Eastern Europe. In Poland at the time of the partition of the country there were over 1 million Jews. According to the Russian census of 1818, the social composition of Eastern Judaism was the following. Ukrainian businessmen, 88.5%. Ukrainian artisans, 12.1%. Ukrainian farmers, 1.4%. Lithuanian and White Russian businessmen, 86.6%. Lithuanian and White Russian artisans, 10.8%. Lithuanian and White Russian farmers, 2.6%. Total businessmen, 86.5%. Total artisans, 11.6%. Total farmers, 1.9%. The percentage of artisans and farmers indicates the beginning of the social differentiation of Judaism. But in a general way, the structure of Eastern Judaism had not yet undergone any important changes, it remained what it had been for many centuries. Certain travelers' stories by soldiers who participated in the Russian campaign of Napoleon constitute invaluable testimony relative to the life of the Jews at the beginning of the 19th century. Many of them, says von Furdenbach, farm out and manage seigneurial manors and exploit taverns. Everything is in their hands. They lend money to lords and peasants and they go to purchase merchandise at Leipzig. Another soldier, the Frenchman Pabusque, in his Lettres sur la guerre en Russie, Paris 1818, supplies interesting information on the role of the Jews in the economic life of the country. They were the intermediaries between the peasants and the lords. The lords farmed out the taverns to them and compelled them to sell only drinks made in their manors. On the occasion of festivals, baptisms, burials, marriages, the peasants were compelled to buy at least a bucket of whiskey. The Jews sold them on credit but exacted heavy interest. They intervened in all the commercial operations of the country. They were also bankers. The author relates that constant business relations linked the Polish Jews to their brothers in Germany. They had their own postal service and were informed about stock exchange quotations everywhere in Europe. The author of Journey of the Muscovite officer V. Bronewski from Trieste to Constantinople in 1810 states, Poland should in all justice be called a Jewish kingdom. The cities and towns are primarily inhabited by them. Rarely will you find a village without Jews. Jewish taverns mark out all the main roads, apart from some rare manors which are administered by the lords themselves, all the others are farmed out or pledged to the Jews. They possess enormous capitals and no one can get along without their help. Only some few very rich lords are not plunged up to the neck in debt with the Jews. The Jews in the villages, writes Commonine in L'Archive de la Russie Méridionale et Occidentale, restrict themselves to farming, leasing, mills, liquor shops and taverns. There is hardly a village without its Jewish farmer. Such is the extent of this that the census often confines the idea of farmer with that of Jew and links the profession to the nationality or to the religion. Instead of writing "there is no Jew in the village," they write, "there is no farmer in the village." Nevertheless, while believing that they were describing the present, these various authors were no longer painting anything but the past. The secular situation of Judaism in Eastern Europe was, very slowly it is true, being swept away in the current of capitalist economy. Even before substituting itself for the old, the new regime was breaking it. The decay of feudalism preceded its replacement by new capitalist forms. The numerical growth of the Jews demanded new and greater means of subsistence while the old economic positions were vanishing. The Jews, adapted for centuries to a natural economy, felt the ground slipping beneath their feet. In that earlier undeveloped economy they had been the middlemen and had held a virtual monopoly of trade. The process of capitalization in Russia and in Poland now led the landed proprietors to attend personally to various branches of production and to drive the Jews out of them. Only a small section of rich Jews could find a favorable field of action in this new situation. On the other hand, the immense majority of Jews, consisting of petty merchants, publicans, and peddlers, suffered greatly from this new state of things. The old trade centers of the feudal epoch declined. New industrial and commercial cities supplanted the small towns and fairs. A native bourgeoisie began to develop. The economic situation of the Jewish masses had become so critical, even before the partition of Poland, that questions of the transformation of the social structure of the Jews and of their emigration became posed automatically. Emigration was possible in this period only within the boundaries of the states into which Poland had been divided. The Jewish masses strove to leave the decadent and backward regions of the former aristocratic kingdom with the continually declining possibilities for subsistence. in order to seek new occupations in the more developed sections of the empires which had inherited Poland. As early as 1776 and 1778, several Polish Jewish communities asked the Russian government for permission to emigrate to Russia. At the beginning of the 19th century, a large stream of emigration is going from former Poland towards Russia. The same was true of the regions annexed by Prussia and Austria. The Jews headed for Berlin, for Vienna, for all the centers in which the pulse of a new economic life was beating, where commerce and industry offered them vast openings. Jewish emigration from Podolia, Volhynia, White Russia, and Lithuania, towards Russia, that of Poznan and Polish Jews to England and even to America, all prove that the Jews of Eastern Europe were looking for countries of immigration as early as the first half of the 19th century. This desire for expatriation went hand in hand with attempts to make the Jews into useful citizens, to adapt them to the new situation by making them artisans and farmers. The Polish Great Sejm of 1784–88 already had the problem of the productivization of the Jews on its agenda. All the governments which had inherited a section of Polish Judaism considered its social structure as an anomaly. Attempts were made to transform the Jews into factory workers. Premiums were granted both to artisans who hired Jewish apprentices and to the Jews who became apprentices. Thousands of Jews were also colonized in certain regions of Russia. Tsar Alexander I encouraged this colonization. Despite great difficulties at the start, these villages succeeded in becoming acclimated in the long run. Two processes characterize the development of the Jewish people in the course of the last century: the process of emigration and the process of social differentiation. The decay of the feudal system and of feudal property and the rapid growth of capitalism in Central and Eastern Europe created new sources for subsistence, but in a far greater measure they destroyed their positions as intermediaries, by which the greatest part of the Jewish people lived. These processes forced the Jewish masses to change their living places as well as their social appearance, forced them to seek a new place in the world and a new occupation in society. At the beginning of the 19th century, the process of productivization is still only in its opening phase. On the one hand, the decline of feudal economy is proceeding rather slowly and the Jews are still able to hang on to their old positions for a long time. On the other hand, the development of capitalism is still clothed in quite primitive forms and a great number of Jews find a vast field for occupations in trade and in artisanry. They played a role as very active commercial agents for young capitalist industry and contributed to the capitalization of agriculture. In general, we may consider that Jewish penetration into capitalist society took place up to the end of the 19th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, however, substantial masses of Jews were compelled to leave Eastern Europe. The annual average of Jewish emigration was 1830 to 1870, 4,000 to 5,000, 1871 to 1880, 8,000 to 10,000, 1881 to 1900. 50,000 to 60,000, 1901 to 1914, 150,000 to 160,000. During the first period, which extends up to 1870, we witness primarily an internal migration directed towards the great cities. From 1830 to 1870, when annual emigration did not exceed 7,000, the Jewish people increased from 3,281,000 to 7,763,000. Consequently, this substantial natural increase was in the main absorbed within the countries inhabited by the Jews. But what an extraordinary change takes place, beginning with 1881 and even more so after 1901, when Jewish emigration reaches the truly impressive figure of 150,000 to 160,000 per annum. What were the causes for this change? The process of capitalization of Russian economy was accelerated by the reform of 1863. Agriculture began to produce increasingly for the market. The bonds of serfdom and of feudal restrictions became looser, social differentiation progressed rapidly in the village. A section of peasants became transformed into well-to-do farmers, another section became proletarianized. Capitalization of agriculture had as effect the opening of an important domestic market for means of production, machines, etc., and for articles of consumption. Capitalist production in agriculture means in effect the following: 1. Division of labor within agriculture due to the specialization of its branches. 2. A growing demand for manufactured products by the enriched peasants and by the proletarianized mass, which has only its labor power to sell and must purchase its subsistence. 3. Agricultural production for the market necessitates a more and more extensive use of machines, and this develops industry in the means of production. 4. Growth in production of the means of production brings with it a continuous increase of the proletarian mass in the cities, and this contributes also to enlarging the market for means of consumption. These vast possibilities within the domestic market gave the Jewish masses, crowded out of their former economic positions, the opportunity to integrate themselves into capitalist economy. Workshops and small industries experienced a great expansion. Whereas the non-Jewish blacksmith or peasant found his way into the factory or the mine, the Jewish proletarianized masses flowed into small industries producing consumers' goods. But there is a fundamental difference between the transformation of the peasant or blacksmith into a steel worker and the transformation of a Jewish merchant into an artisan or garment worker. Capitalist development of the branches of heavy industry is accompanied by a change in the material conditions of production. Not only do the means of production change their destination, but they also change their form. The primitive tool becomes the perfected modern machine. The same is not true of the means of consumption. Clothing, whether it be produced for the maker's own use or for the local or world market, does not change its appearance. The same is not true of the tool, which is transformed into the ever-increasingly perfected machine, and which requires the investment of increasingly greater capital. In order to undertake the manufacture of machines, it is necessary, from the very beginning, to have a large capital. This is explained, especially in the beginning, by the length of the working period, the number of consecutive working days required in a branch of production for the completion of the finished product. According to the working period required by the specific nature of the product, or by the useful effect aimed at, is short or long, a continuous investment of additional circulating capital, wages, raw and auxiliary materials, is required. It is for this reason that from its very beginning production of the means of production has taken place in the capitalist form of large factories, whereas the production of means of consumption can continue to be carried out in the same artisan workshops as before. It is only much later that the great factory crowds out the workshop and its outmoded methods of work in this latter sphere as well. This follows upon the invention of perfected machines, which then invade the sector of the means of consumption. It is, consequently, the growth of fixed capital which here plays a dominant role. In this way, conditions of production in these two main sectors of economy are brought to the same level. Whether a steam engine transfers its value daily to some yarn, which is the product of a continuous labor process, or for 3 months to a locomotive, which is the product of a continuous process, is immaterial for the investment of the capital required for the purchase of the steam engine. In either case, the reproduction of the steam engine may not take place until after 20 years. The liberation of the peasants in Russia had created a big market for manufactured products. Instead of an economy still largely feudal, the production of exchange values becomes established. Russia begins to become the granary of Europe. Cities, centers of trade and industry, rapidly develop. The Jews leave the small towns en masse in order to settle in the great urban centers, where they contribute heavily to the development of trade and artisan industry, means of consumption. In 1900, out of 21 important cities in Poland, Jews are an absolute majority in 11 of them. Migration of the Jews into the large cities is accompanied by a social differentiation which shakes the traditional bases of Judaism. But the development of the means of production sector brings about a mechanization of agriculture and light industry. Machines begin to compete fiercely with the small Jewish artisan workshops. Towards the end of the last century, a great mass of non-Jewish workers migrates to the great cities, where the rhythm of increase in the Jewish population is falling off and even coming to a complete halt. Jewish artisan industries, which developed because of the expansion of the domestic market, succumb for the most part because of the mechanization and modernization of industry. It was difficult for the Jewish artisan to compete with the peasant masses flowing in from the country, who had a very low standard of living and were accustomed to hard physical labor from earliest times. Of course, in some places Jewish workers, surmounting all difficulties, also found a place in mechanized industries, but for the most part they had to take the path of exile at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. The process of transformation of the Jewish pre-capitalist merchant into a craft worker is crossed by another process, that of the elimination of the Jewish worker by the machine. This last process influences the first. The Jewish masses, crowded out of the small towns, are no longer able to become proletarianized and are forced to emigrate. Herein, in large part, lies the explanation of the enormous growth in Jewish emigration at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Whereas dissolution of the old feudal economy and creation of the domestic market had similar effects on the Jewish and non-Jewish masses, industrial mechanization and concentration produced opposite results. From that also arise certain different tendencies in Jewish emigration from those of general emigration. Jewish emigration is relatively late and continues to increase, whereas the reverse is often the case for general emigration. For example, in Germany annual emigration, which fluctuated between 100,000 and 200,000 persons from 1880 to 1892, never exceeded 20,000 at the beginning of the 20th century. This heavy drop in German emigration is explained by the tremendous economic development of Germany in this period. The phenomenon of the elimination of the Jews from industry leads us quite naturally to the subject of the Jewish proletariat. The confinement of the Jewish working class in consumer goods industries undoubtedly constitutes one of the most remarkable phenomena of the economic and social structure of the Jewish people. The fact that a tiny number of Jewish workers is involved in the initial phases of industrial production, whereas their percentage in the final phases is extremely high, strikingly characterizes what has become known as the Jewish anomaly. This economic base of the Jewish proletariat is not alone weak in itself, it is also continually contracted by technological development. The Jewish workers not only suffer the inconveniences inherent in craft industry, notably social weakness, seasonal employment, sharpening exploitation and bad working conditions, but they are increasingly driven out of their economic positions. Capitalist economy is characterized by the uninterrupted growth of constant capital at the expense of variable capital, or to put this another way, by the increase in the importance of capital constituted by means of production and the decrease in the importance of capital which buys the form of labor. This economic process produces the familiar phenomena of elimination of the worker by the machine, of annihilation of the artisan workshop by the factory, and of a decrease in the specific weight of the section of the class producing consumers' goods relative to the other section which is engaged in the manufacture of means of production. Official economics thus characterizes this process. The one certain fact, and it is a very important one, is that the economic evolution of the past 100 or 150 years has operated in the direction of the increase in relative importance of fixed capital and the decrease in relative importance of circulating capital. The more primitive man is, the more important is the work which allows him to satisfy his immediate needs. But the more humanity progresses, the more it turns first towards the tool, and later towards the machine, which enormously increases its productive power. First the tool is an appendage to man, then man becomes an appendage to the tool. This recollection of the rather well-known economic process serves but to underline its decisive importance in the specific situation of the Jewish working class and allows us to proceed immediately to our subject. The question which becomes posed immediately and which has not up to now received any attention is to find the historic cause or causes for this state of things. In the substantial study dedicated to Jewish economy at the beginning of the 19th century, which was undertaken by Leszczynski in his book The Development of the Jewish People in the Last 100 Years, he writes as follows on the professional composition of Jewish and non-Jewish artisans in this period. The most superficial glance over this comparative statistical material is sufficient to note that those trades were in the hands of Jewish artisans which had the smallest chance of going over to factory production, whereas, precisely to the contrary, the professions most adapted to this transformation were widespread among non-Jewish artisans. In Galicia, non-Jews constituted 99.6% of the metalworkers, 99.2% of the weavers, 98.2% of the blacksmiths, 98.1% of the spinners, whereas, in sharp contrast, 94.3% of the tailors and 70.0% of the furriers were Jews. These first four trades were the labor foundation on which the textile and metallurgical industries were later constructed. Without these trained workers which large-scale industry inherited from artisanry, the birth of these industries would have been impossible. It is in this historic fact that the fundamental cause may lie for the weak penetration of large-scale industry by the Jews. It was no more than natural that the first workers' cadres in the metallurgical and textile plants should consist exclusively of non-Jews. And these compact masses of non-Jewish workers certainly had a natural attractive force for the non-Jewish populations which were closer to them from the religious, national, and psychological point of view, whereas, on the other hand, they repelled the Jewish mass which has remained foreign to them in every way up to this day. Leszczynski's explanation contributes to clarifying the problem with which we are engaged and shows us the first immediate cause for the specific professional structure of the Jewish working class. But in its turn, it places before us a new problem, or rather raises the old one to a new level. If we now clearly see the present Jewish worker as a descendant of the 18th century artisan, we must still find an explanation of the different professional composition of Jewish and non-Jewish artisans in that period. Why were the former primarily tailors and the non-Jewish artisans blacksmiths? Why were the latter to be found in trades linked with production, and the former confined to clothing, producing consequently for consumption? To pose the question in this way is practically to resolve it. Natural economy which ruled Eastern Europe in this period was characterized by the almost exclusive production of use values and implied an almost complete absence of the division of labor into trades. Each family was self-sufficient or practically so, producing everything necessary for the satisfaction of its needs. Here is how van der Velde describes this state of affairs. Each family is sufficient to itself or practically so. It is lodged in a house made of timber coming from the nearest forest, and obtains straw and mortar right on the spot. It warms itself exclusively and primarily with turf, heather, furze, dead wood gathered in the vicinity. It spins, weaves, transforms flax and hemp of its own harvesting into clothes. It feeds itself with its own wheat, potatoes, vegetables. It bakes its bread, makes its wine, or beer, dries its own tobacco, exchanges its eggs and butter against rare goods which it secures from without, candles, oil, ironware, etc. In short, it produces almost everything which it consumes and consumes all that it produces, selling only what is strictly necessary to meet very limited money expenses. The same could be said, with very little correction, regarding the feudal manor. It is readily understandable that while such an economic system does not absolutely exclude professional specialization, the few trades that find a place within it are the products of quite exceptional conditions. We should consider the labors of the blacksmith and the potter as the first which rose to special professions because they demanded from the very beginning more skill and more specialized working equipment. Even among nomad peoples, special artisans devoted themselves to the iron trade. It is therefore easy to understand that even in the era of natural economy, the trades of blacksmith and of weaver were spread throughout the villages and abounded in the cities, which, in Eastern Europe, were almost exclusively military and administrative centers. In Galicia, in Bukovina, in many parts of Hungary, Romania, and Transylvania, as among the Yugoslav peoples, there were up to recent times no artisans other than blacksmiths. Non-Jewish artisanry in Eastern Europe was therefore the product of special causes which, in a society based on natural and not exchange economy, nevertheless requires an exchange of services. Completely different was the point of departure of Jewish artisanry. It was born in the specific conditions of the small Jewish town and produced for that town. But whoever speaks of the small Jewish town of the 18th century speaks of an agglomeration of small traders, publicans, bankers, and intermediaries of all sorts. The Jewish artisan therefore did not work for the peasant producers, but for the merchants, the banker intermediaries. It is here that we must seek the fundamental cause for the specific professional structure of the Jewish proletariat and of its ancestor, Jewish artisanry. The non-Jewish artisan did not produce articles of consumption for the peasant because, as we have seen, the latter was sufficient to himself in this regard. But that was precisely the principal occupation of the Jewish artisan, his clientele being composed of men devoted to trade in money and in goods, thus non-producers by definition. Alongside of the peasant, we find the non-Jewish blacksmith artisan. Close to the money man, we find the Jewish tailor. The professional difference existing between the Jewish and non-Jewish artisans therefore derives in the last analysis from the difference in their spheres of activity. It goes without saying that this explanation is necessarily schematic and like all schemas allows us to understand phenomena in their general aspect but cannot present the diversity of real life with complete exactness. But to try to reflect the latter with exactness and in detail would mean in turn to make it difficult to understand the general processes which derive from it. Sociology is therefore compelled to make a complete and continuous circuit, from reality to theoretical schema and the reverse. Those who reproach this method for not reflecting the entire diversity of life have not completely understood this dialectical interdependence. It should also be noted that the struggles which broke out in certain periods between Jewish and non-Jewish artisans appear to have been provoked by the encroachment of one section of artisans upon the sphere of activity of another and should not be attributed to some alleged national competition which was simply inconceivable in the feudal epoch because it is prior to the formation of nations. Nationality is a sentiment unknown to the heterogeneous society of the Middle Ages. By way of illustration, we quote this passage from an ancient chronicle of Prague. The Ramshacky Chronic of 1491, Jews were forbidden to do work for Christians but they were all free to work for Jewish clients. The City Council of Prague also complains in the same period, that the Jews pay no attention to the old privileges and ordinances whereby they are forbidden to work for Christians. At Posen, States Greets, Jews were allowed to engage in certain trades, like that of tailoring, but only to satisfy their own needs and not for Christians. It seems to me that we have thus traversed the causal chain leading from the present-day economic structure of the Jewish proletariat back to its origins. It is complete in this sense that it brings us back to the social problem of a more general order, which has already been explored, that of the social and economic function of the Jews in the pre-capitalist era. *6. Contradictory trends in the Jewish problem during the period of the rise of capitalism. The French Revolution put the finishing touches to the course of the economic and social evolution of Judaism in Western Europe. The development of industrial capitalism will speed up the penetration of the Jews into the ranks of the bourgeoisie and their cultural assimilation. The triumphant march of the Napoleonic armies was the signal for Jewish emancipation everywhere. Napoleonic policy reflected the will of bourgeois society to assimilate the Jews completely. But in the regions still ruled by the feudal system, important difficulties surged across the road to emancipation. Thus, contrary to the Jews of Bordeaux, completely absorbed into the bourgeois class, the Alsatian Jews were little differentiated from their ancestors of the Middle Ages. The peasant riots against Jewish usury compelled Napoleon to promulgate exceptional laws against Alsatian Judaism. Bourgeois juridical norms proved inapplicable to a feudal state of society. The same was true of Poland, where formal legality for all citizens before the law introduced by Napoleon was not applicable to Jews for a period of 10 years, as the face-saving formula put it. It is necessary to add that the great mass of Polish Jews, led by fanatical rabbis, was resolutely opposed to emancipation. Except for a small layer of wealthy bourgeois, the Polish Jews in no way felt the need for civil equality. But in general, from the beginning of the 19th century, Western Judaism enters on the road of complete assimilation. By the end of the 18th century, one half of the Jews of Berlin had become converted to Christianity in a period of 30 years. Those who remained faithful to the Jewish religion vigorously denied that they formed a distinct nation. Without a land, without a state, without a language, there can be no nation, and that is why Judaism long ago ceased to constitute a nation, said Riesser, one of the representatives of the German Jews in the first half of the 19th century. We are Germans, and Germans only, in whatever concerns nationality, a Jewish professor of Berlin wrote somewhat later, in 1879. Contrary to Western Europe, where their assimilation was favored by capitalism, in Eastern Europe capitalism uprooted the Jews from their secular economic positions. Thus, by provoking a flow of Jews towards the West with its left hand, it was destroying the accomplishments of its right hand. Waves of Eastern Jews continuously flowed towards the Western countries and instilled new life into the moribund body of Judaism. Our great popular masses of the East, who are still rooted in Jewish tradition, or at least live in its atmosphere, form a barrier to the disappearance of Western Judaism. Western Judaism no longer exists save as a reflection of Eastern Judaism. In order to understand the importance of the immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe, it is sufficient to recall that in Vienna, at the beginning of the 19th century, there were only several hundred Jews, and that in the 20th century, their number reached 176,000. The massive emigration of Jews to Western Europe and mainly to America went hand in hand with a complete transformation of the territorial structure of Judaism. We know that the advance of capitalism was accompanied by an enormous extension of urban developments. From the middle of the 19th century on, the great centers of commercial and industrial life became a powerful attractive pull for the Jews. The concentration of the Jewish masses in great cities was as obvious in the countries of immigration as in the regions from which the Jews originated. The Jews en masse forsook the little towns which had for centuries been the centers of their economic life and flowed either into the commercial and industrial cities of Poland and Russia, or towards the great cities of the Western world, Vienna, London, Berlin, Paris, and New York. Far into the 19th century the greater part of world Jewry inhabited Eastern Europe, where in the absence of good means of communication small towns continued to offer opportunities to traders, and, during that period the Jews lived predominantly in small towns. According to a statistical survey of the Polish provinces of Kiev, Volhynia, and Podolia, made in the second half of the 18th century, there were in every village, on the average, 7 Jewish inhabitants, i.e., 1 Jewish family. But there were innumerable villages and very few towns. In East Silesia, therefore, 27.0% of the Jewish population lived in villages, and in West Galicia, even 43.1%. Similar conditions prevailed in a few German states, for instance, in Hesse and Baden. This condition underwent a decisive change in the 20th century. Substantial Jewish masses became concentrated in the urban centers of the world. In Russia, between 1847 and 1926, the Jewish population in communities numbering more than 10,000 multiplied eightfold. In 1847, there were only 3 Jewish communities comprising more than 10,000 people in the entire Russian Empire. There were 28 of these in 1897 and 38 in 1926, in the old territory of Holy Russia. The percentage of Russian Jews living in large communities was 1847. 5.0%. 1897. 28.2%. 1926. 50.2%. Here are the corresponding figures for Germany. 1850. 6.0%. 1880. 32.0%. 1900. 61.3%. More than 3/4 of American Jews are presently living in communities of more than 10,000 persons. The tremendous Jewish agglomerations of New York, 2 million, Warsaw, 300,000 to 500,000, Paris, London, etc., bear witness to the fact that the Jews have become the greatest urban people in the world. The concentration of the Jewish masses in the great cities undoubtedly constitutes one of the most important phenomena of Jewish life in the modern capitalist epoch. We have already examined the difference between Jewish emigration up to 1880 and the exodus after that date. Up to 1880, the states inhabited by the Jews still offered vast possibilities for penetration into capitalist economy. Migration was primarily internal. After this date, events are precipitous. Feudal economy is smashed to bits, and with it goes the ruin of the artisan branches of capitalism in which the Jews are very widely represented. The Jews begin to forsake their countries of origin in great masses. Between 1800 and 1880, the number of Jews in the United States, the main destination of Jewish immigrants, rose from a few thousands to 230,000, which points to an average yearly immigration of about 2,000. Between 1881 and 1899, the yearly average reached 30,000, and between 1900 and 1914, 100,000. Adding the emigration to other overseas countries, Canada, the Argentine, South Africa, Palestine, etc., and to Central and Western Europe, the total Jewish emigration from Eastern Europe during the years 1800 to 1880 must be put at about 250,000, i.e. a yearly average of about 3,000, for 1881-99, at 1 million and a yearly average of about 50,000, and for 1900 to 1914 at 2 million, and an average of 135,000. Percentually, these figures place the East European Jews first among emigrant nations. About the middle of the period 1881 to 1914, their number in Russia, Galicia, and Romania amounted to about 6.5 million, and measured by that figure, the emigrants formed about 46%. The corresponding Italian rate, which is otherwise the highest in Europe, was only 15% after the re-emigrants had been deducted. These were numerous among the Italians, but very few among the Jews. This great emigration was favored by the high birth rate of the Jews. Their number in the world rose as follows. 1825. 3,281,000. 1900. 10,602,500. 1850. 4,764,500. 1925. 14,800,500. 1880. 7,663,000. Between 1825 and 1925, the number of Jews multiplied 5 times, a rate of increase 1.5 times larger than that of the population of Europe. The number of Jews must certainly exceed 18 million at the present time. It is important to note that despite the high emigration figures, not only has the number of Jews in Eastern Europe not decreased, but it has even greatly increased. Judaism in Eastern Europe sent abroad almost 4 million persons in the course of the last 35 years, and yet not only has the number of Jews in Eastern Europe not diminished during this period, but it has greatly increased. It has gone from less than 6 to 8 millions. Emigration contributed to the social differentiation of Judaism, a process which had made rapid progress in the course of the 19th century. At least 90% of the Jews were agents and merchants at the beginning of the capitalist era. In the 20th century, we can consider that in America we have almost 2 million Jewish proletarians, who are almost 40% of all the economically active Jews. Here is the professional division for all Jews in 1932. Trade, including transportation. Amusement, banking 6,100,000. 38.6% industry, including mining and artisanry 5,750,000. 36.4% liberal professions and administration. 1 million. 6.3% agriculture. 625,000. 4.0% part-time workers and domestics. 325,000. 2.0% no trade, living from incomes. Pensions, or charity 2 million. 12.7% total. 15,800,000. The number of Jewish workers, relatively low in the backward countries like Poland where it reaches about 25% of all persons economically active, reaches 46% in America. The professional structure of the Jewish working class still differs greatly from that of the proletariat of other peoples. Thus white-collar workers form 30 to 36% of all Jewish wage earners, which is a proportion 3 to 4 times as great as among other nations. Agricultural workers, practically completely missing among the Jews, constitute from 15 to 25% of non-Jewish workers. 60 to 70% of the Jews employed in industry are in reality worker artisans. In Eastern Europe, 80% of the proletarians work in shops and not in factories, whereas among the workers of other nationalities, 75 to 80% are factory workers. Finally, the Jewish workers are employed primarily in branches of consumer goods. Non-Jewish workers in the same branches form only a small percentage of the proletariat as a whole. Comparative statistics of the professional division of Jewish and Aryan workers will permit of an easier grasp of this phenomenon. In several European countries, Jews, non-Jews, clothing, 43.7, 8.5, food, 11.0, 9.5, leather, 10.5, 1.7, metallurgy, 8.6, 19.9, lumber, 7.9, 6.9, textiles, 6.8, 12.0, building, 4.2, 15.2, printing and paper, 3.2, 3.2, others, 3.8, 22.1. In Poland, 1931. Jewish workers, non-Jewish workers, artisanry, 58.7, 33.2, business and transportation, 18.7, 12.5, homework, 9.2, 1.9, small industry, 8.9, 9.6, medium and large industry, 3.8, 23.0, mines, 0.4, 8.4, electricity, water, railroads, 0.3, 8.9, foundries, 2.5. These statistics clearly show that the Jews are employed primarily in artisanry, whereas non-Jewish workers, on the contrary, are concentrated mainly in heavy industry. Jews are relatively 5 times more numerous than non-Jewish workers in the clothing industry, but in metallurgy, the textile industry, and building, non-Jewish workers are 2 or 3 times more numerous than Jewish workers. However, while the professional structure of the Jewish working class still differs greatly from that of the non-Jewish, poverty is driving them more and more to the penetration, despite all barriers, into professions which had been inaccessible to them up to now. Some 20 years ago, when a great industrialist of Łódź was asked about the ban against Jewish workers in his factories, he replied, "I do not want to have 2,000 partners in my business." But prior to this war, World War II, 15% of Jewish workers were operating machines. Judaism has therefore undergone a very important transformation in the capitalist epoch. The people class has become differentiated socially. But this process, while of considerable scope, is accompanied by a multitude of contradictory tendencies, which have not as yet allowed the crystallization of a stable form for Judaism in our period. It is far easier to say what Judaism has been than to define what it is. In effect, The evolution of the Jewish question resulting from capitalist development has been thrust onto diametrically opposite paths. On the one hand, capitalism favored the economic assimilation of Judaism and consequently its cultural assimilation. On the other hand, by uprooting the Jewish masses, concentrating them in cities, provoking the rise of anti-Semitism, it stimulated the development of Jewish nationalism. The renaissance of the Jewish nation, the formation of a modern Jewish culture, elaboration of the Yiddish language, Zionism, all these accompany the processes of emigration and of the concentration of Jewish masses in the cities and go hand in hand with the development of modern anti-Semitism. In all parts of the world, along all the roads of exile, the Jewish masses, concentrated in special quarters, created their own special cultural centers, their newspapers, their Yiddish schools. Naturally, it was in the countries of greatest Jewish concentration, in Russia, Poland, and the United States, that the national movement took on its greatest scope. But the development of history is dialectical. At the same time that the bases for a new Jewish nationality were being elaborated, all the conditions were likewise being created for its disappearance. Whereas the first Jewish generations in the countries of immigration still remained firmly attached to Judaism, the new generations rapidly lost their special customs and language. Among the East European immigrants to Western Europe, America, and other non-European countries, Yiddish is still retained, at any rate in the first generation, though a large number of English words are introduced, so that it is growing into a dialect different from the Polish or Lithuanian Yiddish. The second generation speak both Yiddish and the language of the country, while the third no longer know Yiddish. The Yiddish press in the United States developed strongly during the last 50 years because of the coming in of more than 2 million East European Jews who knew no English, but of recent years, a marked decline has set in of the Yiddish press, immigration having stopped, while the younger generation is becoming Americanized. In 1920, according to official statistics, Yiddish was the mother tongue of 32.1% of American Jews, in 1930, of 27.8%. In Hungary, Yiddish disappeared almost completely. In the census of 1920, 95.2% declared Hungarian as their mother tongue, 4.0% German, and 0.8% other languages. Throughout the world, in 1900, 60.6% of the Jews spoke Yiddish. In 1930, 42.7% of the Jews spoke Yiddish. During this same period that the use of Yiddish is declining, we witness a considerable growth in mixed marriages. The more highly developed the country, the more frequent are its mixed marriages. In Bohemia, 44.7% of all marriages in which at least one party was Jewish were mixed marriages. As against this, the number of mixed marriages in Subcarpathian Russia and Slovakia was insignificant. Ratio of mixed marriages between Jews and non-Jews. To purely Jewish marriages. Berlin. 1901-4. 35.4%. 1905. 44.4%. Hamburg. 1903-5. 49.5%. Trieste. 1900-1903. 61.5%. Copenhagen. 1880-89 55.8%. 1890-99 68.7%. 1900-1905. 82.9%. An increase in conversions is also noted. Thus in Vienna, the average of Jewish conversions went from 0.4% in 1870 to 4.4% in 1916-20. However, the general weakening of religion removes most of the importance from this index. We thus see how precarious are the bases for the national renaissance of Judaism. Emigration, at first a powerful obstacle to assimilation and a nationalization factor of the Jews, rapidly changes into an instrument of fusion of the Jews with other peoples. The concentration of Jewish masses in the great cities, which thus became a sort of territorial base for the Jewish nationality, cannot long impede the process of assimilation. The atmosphere of the great urban centers constitutes a melting pot in which all national differences are rapidly wiped out. While capitalism first created conditions for a certain Jewish national renaissance, by uprooting millions of Jews, by tearing them from their traditional living conditions and concentrating them in large cities, it soon contributes to accelerating the process of assimilation. The development of Yiddish, for example, is followed by its rapid decline. Capitalist development, although at times in rather unexpected ways, ends with the fusion of the Jews among other peoples. But at the beginning of the 20th century the signs of capitalist degeneration become manifest. The Jewish question, which seems to be developing normally in the 19th century, rebounds with unprecedented sharpness as a result of the decline of capitalism. The solution of the Jewish question appears to be farther off than ever. 7. The decay of capitalism and the tragedy of the Jews in the 20th century. The primary merit of the capitalist regime lay in its tremendous expansion of the productive forces, its creation of a world economy, its permitting an unprecedented development of technology and science. As against the stagnation of the feudal world, capitalism presented an unparalleled dynamism. Hundreds of millions of people, immobilized up to then in a routinized, horizonless existence, suddenly found themselves drawn into the current of a feverish and intensive life. The Jews lived within the pores of feudal society. When the feudal structure started to crumble, it began expelling elements which were, at one and the same time, foreign to it and indispensable to it. Even before the peasant had left the village for the industrial center, the Jew had abandoned the small medieval town in order to emigrate to the great cities of the world. The destruction of the secular function of Judaism within feudal society is accompanied by its passive penetration into capitalist society. But if capitalism has given humanity certain tremendous conquests, only its disappearance can allow humanity to enjoy them. Only socialism will be able to lift humanity to the level of the material basis of civilization. But capitalism survives and all the enormous acquisitions turn more and more against the most elementary interests of humanity. The progress of technology and science has become the progress of the science of death and its technology. The development of the means of production is nothing but the growth of the means of destruction. The world, become too small for the productive apparatus built up by capitalism, is constricted even further by the desperate efforts of each imperialism to extend its sphere of influence. While unbridled export constitutes an inseparable phenomenon of the capitalist mode of production, decaying capitalism tries to get along without it, that is to say, it adds to its disorders the disorder of its own suppression. Powerful barriers impede the free circulation of merchandise and men. Insurmountable obstacles arise before the masses deprived of work and bread following the breakdown of the traditional feudal world. The decay of capitalism has not only accelerated the decomposition of feudal society but has multiplied 100-fold the sufferings which resulted from it. The bearers of civilization, in a blind alley, bar the road to those who wish to become civilized. Unable to attain civilization, the latter are still less able to remain in the stage of barbarism. To the peoples whose traditional basis of existence it has destroyed, capitalism bars the road of the future after having closed the road of the past. It is with these general phenomena that the Jewish tragedy of the 20th century is tied up. The highly tragic situation of Judaism in our epoch is explained by the extreme precariousness of its social and economic position. The first to be eliminated by decaying feudalism, the Jews were also the first to be rejected by the convulsions of dying capitalism. The Jewish masses find themselves wedged between the anvil of decaying feudalism and the hammer of rotting capitalism. A. The Jews in Eastern Europe. The entire situation of Judaism in Eastern Europe is explained by the combination of the decline of the old feudal forms and of the degeneration of capitalism. The social differentiation which took place in the village as a result of capitalist penetration brought about an influx into the cities of enriched as well as proletarianized peasants. The former wanted to invest their capital, the latter to offer their labor. But the openings for the placement of capital were as slight as those for work. Hardly born, the capitalist system already showed all the symptoms of senility. The general decay of capitalism manifested itself in crises and unemployment within the countries of Eastern Europe, by the closing of all the outlets for emigration outside their frontiers. 7 to 8 million peasants were landless and almost without work in independent Poland. Placed between two fires, the Jews were exposed to the hostility of the petty bourgeoisie and the peasantry, who sought to find a place for themselves at the expense of the Jews. Jewish positions are particularly threatened by the urban Polish bourgeoisie and by the rich peasants who seek a solution for their difficulties through a fierce economic nationalism, whereas the Polish working class suffering from permanent unemployment, seeks a remedy for its poverty through social liberation and puts its reliance upon economic and political solidarity rather than upon a sterile and murderous competition. It is precisely in the regions which capitalism had most developed that a non-Jewish commercial class formed most rapidly. It is there that the anti-Semitic struggle was fiercest. The decrease in the number of Jewish shops has been greatest in the central provinces, that is to say, in a region where the population is purely Polish, where the peasants have attained a higher standard of living, where industry is more developed, which is very important for the material and intellectual situation of the village. Whereas in 1914, 72% of the stores in the villages were Jewish, this fell to 34% in 1935, that is to say, by more than one half. The situation was better for the Jews in territories less developed economically. The participation of Jews in commerce is more important in the most backward provinces, maintains Lipovsky. The eastern sections belonging to White Russians are, in all their relations, economic, intellectual, and political, the most backward part of Poland. In these regions, the absolute majority of Jewish businessmen has increased by a third. In 1938, 82.6% of the shops in the backward regions of Poland were in the hands of Jews. All of these facts are further proof that the destruction of feudalism is at the bottom of the Jewish question in Eastern Europe. The more backward a region is, the more easily are the Jews able to preserve their secular positions. But it is the general decay of capitalism which renders the Jewish question impossible of solution. The crisis and chronic unemployment make it impossible for the Jews to go into other professions, producing a frightful crowding in the professions which they follow and unceasingly augmenting anti-Semitic violence. The governments of the provincial nobles and large capitalists naturally endeavored to organize the anti-Jewish current and thereby divert the masses from their real enemy. Resolve the Jewish question became for them a synonym for the solution of the social question. In order to make place for the national forces, the state organized a systematic struggle for de-Judifying all the professions. The methods of Polonizing business in Poland proceeded from simple boycotting of Jewish stores by means of propaganda, right up to pogroms and incendiarism. Here, by way of example, is a victory bulletin published June 14, 1936, in the governmental paper Ilustrowani Kurczakowskieni. 160 Polish business positions were conquered during the first months of this year in the Madam district. At Prztyk alone, a notorious pogrom city, 50 business licenses were purchased by Poles. All in all, 2,500 Polish business positions were conquered in the various districts. Jewish craftsmanship was no more tenderly handled by the Polish governments. Boycott, exorbitant taxes, Polish examinations, thousands of Jewish craftsmen did not know this language, contributed to grinding down the Jewish artisans. Deprived of unemployment relief, the craft proletariat was one of the most disinherited. The wages of Jewish workers were very low and their living conditions frightful, workday up to 18 hours. The universities constituted the favorite arena for the anti-Semitic struggle. The Polish bourgeoisie exerted all its efforts to prevent Jews from entering the intellectual professions. The Polish universities became places of veritable pogroms, throwing people out of windows, etc. Well before Hitler's Stars of David, the Polish bourgeoisie initiated ghetto benches in the universities. Legal measures, more circumspect but no less effective, rendered entry into the universities almost impossible for the Jewish youth, whose ancestral heritage had strongly developed their intellectual faculties. The percentage of Jewish students in Poland declined from 24.5% in 1923-33 to 13.2% in 1933-36. The same policy of excluding Jewish students was followed in Lithuania and Hungary. The percentage of Jewish students in Lithuania declined from 15.7% in 1920 to 8.5% in 1931, in Hungary, from 31.7% in 1918 to 10.5% in 1931. In general, the situation of the Jews in Hungary had for centuries resembled in every way that of Poland. In the country of great feudal magnates, the Jews for a long time played the role of an intermediary class between the lords and the peasants. One of our correspondents reminds us that at the end of the 19th century, a certain Count de Palugyay had great trouble in avoiding expulsion from the National Club of the Hungarian nobility at Budapest, because he wanted to take charge personally of the industrial transformation of his agricultural products, particularly the distillation of alcohol and whiskey from potatoes. He had even gone so far as to take charge of their sale. The liberal professions were likewise not unaffected by this prejudice, which was as widespread among the high aristocracy as among the petty nobility. Shortly before the fall of the dual monarchy, a Hungarian magnate expressed his disgust of noblemen, who for money, examined the throats of individuals whom they did not know. A natural consequence of this attitude was that the Jews formed the intermediary class between the peasantry and the nobility, particularly in the towns. Trade, and especially petty trade, was a Jewish matter in the eyes of the people. Even today, in the minds of the masses of the Magyar population, the shop, and in a general way everything connected with the exploitation of the shop are thought of as Jewish, even if this shop has become an instrument of economic struggle against the Jews. Here is a story which strikingly illustrates this state of mind. A peasant woman sent her son on some purchasing errands. She wanted them taken care of at the semi-statized Hanya cooperative and not at a Jewish shop, so she said to him, Pista, go to the Jew, not to the Jew who is a Jew, but to the new shop. The process of elimination of the Jews from their economic positions took place in all of Eastern Europe. The situation of the Jewish masses became hopeless. A declassed youth, having no possibility of integrating itself into economic life, lived in black despair. Prior to the Second War, 40% of the Jewish population of Poland had to resort to philanthropic institutions. Tuberculosis raged. Let us give the floor to correspondents of the Economic and Statistical section of the Jewish Scientific Institute residing in regions where despair and the complete absence of a better future were stifling the Jewish youth. Here is what one wrote of Mierzerzex, province of Volhynia. The condition of the Jewish youth is very difficult, notably that of the sons and daughters of tradesmen who are without work because their parents do not require assistance. It is impossible to open new businesses. 75 boys and 120 young girls, aged 15 to 28 years, have no hope whatever of integrating themselves into the economic life of the country. Of Soljo, province of Łódź, we are in possession of a more detailed picture, which is characteristic of the small towns of Poland. Almost 50% of the children of Jewish business people work with their parents, but solely because they are unable to find another job. 25% are learning some sort of trade and 25% are completely idle. 70% of the children of artisans remain in the workshops of their parents even though the latter are almost without work and can very well get along without assistance. 10% are learning new trades, 20% have nothing to do. The sons of rabbis and of employees of Jewish communities are trying to attain a livelihood by learning a trade. The entire youth desires to emigrate, 90% to Palestine, but because of the limited number of emigration visas, their chances are slim. And yet they are ready to go to the North Pole or the South Pole, just so long as they can tear themselves out of this stagnation. More and more the youth is turning towards the crafts and the number of young people in business is on the decline. B. The Jews in Western Europe. The condition of Judaism, rendered hopeless in Eastern Europe by the combined decay of feudalism and capitalism, which created a stifling atmosphere filled with insane antagonisms, had repercussions of a certain worldwide character. Western and Central Europe became the theater of a frightful rise of anti-Semitism. Whereas the reduction in Jewish emigration, whose average annual rate declined from 155,000 between 1901 and 1914 to 43,657 between 1926 and 1935, greatly aggravated the situation of the Jews in Eastern Europe. The general crisis of capitalism made even this reduced emigration an intolerable burden to the Western countries. The Jewish question reached unprecedented sharpness not only in the countries of emigration but in the countries of immigration as well. Even before the First Imperialist War, the mass arrival of Jewish immigrants created a strong anti-Semitic movement among the middle classes of several Central and Western European countries. We need only recall the great successes of the anti-Semitic Social Christian Party at Vienna and of its leader, Luger, the sweeping rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, Trijka, and the Dreyfus Affair. Anti-Semitism showed its roots most clearly in Vienna, one of the great centers of Jewish immigration before the First Imperialist War. The petty bourgeoisie, ruined by the development of monopoly capitalism and headed for proletarianization, was exasperated by the mass arrival of the Jewish element, traditionally petty bourgeois and artisan. After the First Imperialist War, the countries of Western and Central Europe, Germany, Austria, France, and Belgium, saw tens of thousands of Jewish immigrants, in tatters, lacking all resources, pour in from Eastern Europe. The seeming post-war prosperity permitted these elements to penetrate into all branches of business and artisanry. But even the Jewish immigrants who had penetrated into the plants did not remain there for long. The long commercial past of the Jews weighed heavily on their descendants, and the favorable post-war economic conditions brought about a perceptible process of deproletarianization in Western Europe as well as in the United States. The Jewish workers retained their artisan position in the countries of immigration. In Paris in 1936, out of 21,083 Jewish workers belonging to trade unions, 9,253 worked at home. The economic catastrophe of 1929 threw the petty bourgeois masses into a hopeless situation. The overcrowding in small business, artisanry and the intellectual professions took on unheard-of proportions. The petty bourgeois regarded his Jewish competitor with growing hostility, for the latter's professional cleverness, the result of centuries of practice, often enabled him to survive hard times more easily. Anti-Semitism even gained the ear of wide layers of worker artisans, who traditionally had been under petty bourgeois influence. It is consequently incorrect to accuse big business of having brought about anti-Semitism. Big business only proceeded to make use of the elementary anti-Semitism of the petty bourgeois masses. It fashioned it into a major component of fascist ideology. By the myth of Jewish capitalism, big business endeavored to divert and control the anti-capitalist hatred of the masses for its own exclusive profit. The real possibility of an agitation against Jewish capitalists lay in the antagonism between monopoly capital and speculative commercial capital, which Jewish capital was in the main. The relatively greater permeability of speculative capital, stock exchange scandal, allowed monopoly capital to channel the hatred of the petty bourgeois masses and even of a part of the workers against Jewish capitalism. See racism. Ideology is a process accomplished by the so-called thinker consciously, indeed, but with a false consciousness. The real motives impelling him remain unknown to him, otherwise it would not be an ideological process at all. Hence he imagines false or apparent motive forces. Up to now we have tried to understand the real basis of anti-Semitism in our time. But it is sufficient to consider the role played in the development of anti-Semitism by the wretched document fabricated by the Tsarist Okhrana, the Protocols of Zion, to become aware of the importance of the false or apparent motive forces of anti-Semitism. In Hitlerite propaganda today, the real motivation of anti-Semitism in Western Europe, the economic competition of the petty bourgeoisie, no longer plays any role. On the contrary, the most fantastic allegations of the Protocols of Zion, the plans of universal domination by international Judaism, reappear in every speech and manifesto of Hitler. We must therefore analyze this mythical ideological element of anti-Semitism. Religion constitutes the most characteristic example of an ideology. Its true motive forces must be sought in the very prosaic domain of the material interests of a class, but it is in the most ethereal spheres that its apparent motive forces are found. Nevertheless, the God who launched the Puritan fanatics of Cromwell against the English aristocracy and Charles I was nothing but the reflection or symbol of the interests of the English peasantry and bourgeoisie. Every religious revolution is in reality a social revolution. It is the unbridled development of the productive forces colliding against the narrow limits of consumption which constitute the true motive force of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. But it is the race which seems to be its most characteristic apparent force. Racism is therefore in the first place the ideological disguise of modern imperialism. The race struggling for its living space is nothing but the reflection of the permanent necessity for expansion which characterizes finance or monopoly capitalism. While the fundamental contradiction of capitalism, the contradiction between production and consumption, involves for the big bourgeoisie the necessity to struggle for the conquest of foreign markets, it compels the petty bourgeoisie to struggle for the expansion of the domestic market. The lack of foreign markets for the big capitalists proceeds hand in hand with the lack of domestic markets for the small capitalists. Whereas the big bourgeoisie struggles furiously against its competitors on the foreign market, the petty bourgeoisie combats its competitors on the domestic market not a whit less fiercely. Racism abroad is consequently accompanied by racism at home. The unprecedented aggravation of capitalist contradictions in the 20th century brings with it a growing exacerbation of racism abroad as well as racism at home. The primarily commercial and artisan character of Judaism, heritage of a long historical past, makes it enemy number one of the petty bourgeoisie on the domestic market. It is therefore the petty bourgeois character of Judaism which makes it so odious to the petty bourgeoisie. But while the historical past of Judaism exercises a determining influence on its present social composition, it has effects no less important on the representation of the Jews in the consciousness of the popular masses. For the latter, the Jew remains the traditional representative of the money power. This fact is of great importance because the petty bourgeoisie is not only a capitalist class, that is to say, a repository in miniature of all capitalist tendencies, it is also anti-capitalist. It has a strong, though vague, consciousness of being ruined and despoiled by big business. But its hybrid character, its interclass position, does not permit it to understand the true structure of society nor the real character of big business. It is incapable of understanding the true tendencies of social evolution, for it has a presentiment that this evolution cannot help but be fatal for it. It wants to be anti-capitalist without ceasing to be capitalist. It wants to destroy the bad character of capitalism, that is to say, the tendencies which are ruining it, while preserving the good character of capitalism which permits it to live and get rich. But since there does not exist a capitalism which has the good tendencies without also possessing the bad, the petty bourgeoisie is forced to dream it up. It is no accident that the petty bourgeoisie has invented supercapitalism, the bad deviation of capitalism, its evil spirit. It is no accident that its theoreticians have struggled mightily for over a century, Proudhon, against bad speculative capitalism and defended useful productive capitalism. The attempt of Nazi theoreticians to distinguish between national productive capital and Jewish parasitic capital is probably the last attempt of this kind. Jewish capitalism can best represent the myth of bad capitalism. The concept of Jewish wealth is in truth solidly entrenched in the consciousness of the popular masses. It is only a question of reawakening and giving presence, by means of a well-orchestrated propaganda, to the image of the usurious Jew, against whom peasant, petty bourgeois, and lord had struggled over a long period. The petty bourgeoisie and the layer of workers remaining under its sway are easily influenced by such propaganda and fall into this trap of Jewish capitalism. Historically, the success of racism means that capitalism has managed to channel the anti-capitalist consciousness of the masses into a form that antedates capitalism and which no longer exists except in a vestigial state. This vestige is nevertheless still sufficiently great to give a certain appearance of reality to the myth. We see that racism is made up of rather strange elements. It reflects the expansionist will of big capital. It expresses the hatred of the petty bourgeoisie for foreign elements within the domestic market as well as its anti-capitalist tendencies. It is in its aspect as a capitalist element that the petty bourgeoisie fights its Jewish competitor, and in its capitalist aspect that it struggles against Jewish capital. Racism finally diverts the anti-capitalist struggle of the masses into a form that antedates capitalism, persisting only in a vestigial state. But while scientific analysis permits us to reveal its component parts, racist ideology must appear as an absolutely homogeneous doctrine. Racism serves precisely to cast all classes into the crucible of a racial community opposed to other races. The racist myth strives to appear as a whole, having only vague connections with its origins which are often very different. It endeavors to fuse its different elements together in perfect fashion. Thus, for example, foreign racism, the ideological disguise of imperialism, is not compelled, in and of itself, to adopt a strong anti-Semitic coloration. But from the necessity of synchronization, it generally does take on this character. The anti-capitalism of the masses, first channeled in the direction of Judaism, is then carried over against the foreign enemy, which is identified with Judaism. The Germanic race will find itself faced with the duty of fighting the Jew, its principal enemy, in all his disguises, that of domestic Bolshevism and liberalism, of Anglo-Saxon plutocracy and of foreign Bolshevism. Hitler states in Mein Kampf that it is indispensable to present the various enemies under a common aspect, otherwise there is a danger that the masses will start thinking too much about the differences which exist among those enemies. That is why racism is a myth and not a doctrine. It demands faith, and fears reason like the plague. Anti-Semitism contributes most to cementing the different elements of racism. Just as it is necessary to cast the different classes into one single race, so is it also necessary that this race have only a single enemy, the international Jew. The myth of race is necessarily accompanied by its negative, the anti-race, the Jew. The racial community is built on hatred of the Jews, a hatred of which the most solid racial foundation is buried in history in a period when the Jew was in effect a foreign body and hostile to all classes. The irony of history was that the most radical anti-Semitic ideology in all history should triumph precisely in the period when Judaism is on the road of economic and social assimilation. But like all ironies of history, this seeming paradox is very understandable. At the time when the Jew was unassimilable, at a time when he really represented capital, he was indispensable to society. There could be no question of destroying him. At the present time, capitalist society, on the edge of the abyss, tries to save itself by resurrecting the Jew and the hatred of the Jews. But it is precisely because the Jews do not play the role which is attributed to them that anti-Semitic persecution can take on such an amplitude. Jewish capitalism is a myth, that is why it is so easily vanquished. But in vanquishing its negative, racism at the same time destroys the foundations for its own existence. In the measure that the phantom of Jewish capitalism disappears, capitalist reality appears in all its ugliness. The social contradictions, banished for a moment by the fumes of racial intoxication, reappear in all their sharpness. In the long run, the myth proves powerless against reality. Despite its apparent homogeneity, the very evolution of racism allows to be clearly discerned the economic, social, and political transformations that it strives to conceal. At the beginning, in order to arm itself for the struggle for its living space, for imperialist war, big business must beat down its domestic enemy, the proletariat. It is the petty bourgeoisie and D-class proletarian elements that furnish it with its shock troops, capable of smashing the economic and political organizations of the proletariat. Racism, at the beginning, appears therefore as an ideology of the petty bourgeoisie. Its program reflects the interests and illusions of this class. It promises struggle against supercapitalism, against the trusts, stock exchange, big department stores, etc. But as soon as big business has succeeded in smashing the proletariat, thanks to the support of the petty bourgeoisie, the latter becomes an unbearable burden to it. The program of preparation for war implies precisely the ruthless elimination of small business, a prodigious development of the trusts, and intensive proletarianization. This same military preparation necessitates the support or at least a kind of neutrality from the proletariat, the most important factor in production. Thus big business does not hesitate for a moment to violate its most solemn promises in the most cynical way and to strangle the petty bourgeoisie in the most brutal fashion. Racism now devotes itself to flattering the proletariat, to appearing as a radically socialist movement. It is here that the Judaist-capitalist identification plays its most important role. The radical expropriation of Jewish capitalists has to fulfill the role of collateral, of endorser of racism's anti-capitalist will to struggle. The anonymous character of the capitalism of the monopolies, in contrast to the generally personal, and often speculative commercial, character of Jewish businesses, facilitates this operation of spiritual swindling. The common man more readily sees the real capitalist, the businessman, the manufacturer, the speculator, than the respectable director of a corporation who is made to pass as an indispensable factor in production. It is in this way that racist ideology reaches the following identifications: Judaism equals capitalism, racism equals socialism, a regulated war economy equals a planned socialist economy. It is undeniable that large layers of workers, deprived of their organizations, blinded by the foreign political successes of Hitler, have allowed themselves to be taken in by racist mythology, just as was the case previously with the petty bourgeoisie. For the time being the bourgeoisie appears to have attained its objective. The furious anti-Jewish persecution extending throughout Europe serves to indicate the definitive victory of racism, the final defeat of international Judaism. D. The Jewish race. The racial theory now dominant is nothing but an attempt to establish racism on a scientific basis. It is devoid of any scientific value. It is enough to observe the pitiful acrobatics which the racist theoreticians perform to demonstrate the relationship of the Germans and the Nipponese, or the irrevocable antagonism between the heroic German spirit and the commercial Anglo-Saxon spirit, in order to be completely convinced of this. The ramblings of a Montaigne on deprostituting the Jewish ethnic entity by compelling the Jews to wear stars of David are certainly not worth much. The real prostitution of certain scholars to racism presents an unusual spectacle of the decline of human dignity. But we see there only an end product of the complete decay of bourgeois science, which had already, under democracy, lost its objectivity. Racist stupidities must not, however, deter us from examining the extent to which it is necessary to speak of a Jewish race. The most superficial examination of the question leads us to the conclusion that the Jews constitute in reality a mixture of the most diverse races. It is evidently the diaspora character of Judaism which is the fundamental cause of this fact. But even in Palestine, the Jews were far from constituting a pure race. Leaving aside the fact that, according to the Bible, the Israelites brought a mass of Egyptians with them when they left Egypt, and that Strabo considered them as descendants of Egyptians, it is enough to recall the numerous races which had established themselves in Palestine: Hittites, Canaanites, Philistines, Aryans, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Greeks, and Arabs. According to Strabo, Judea was inhabited by Phoenicians, Egyptians, and Arabs. The development of Jewish proselytism during the Greek and Roman era strongly accentuated the mixed character of Judaism. As early as 139 BC, the Jews were driven out of Rome for having made proselytes there. The community of Antioch was composed in large part of proselytes. Proselytism continued even during subsequent eras. The compulsory conversion of slaves to Judaism, the conversion of the Khazars as well as of other races and tribes in the course of the long diaspora, have been so many factors which have made a characteristic conglomeration of races out of Judaism. At the present time there is absolutely no racial homogeneity between the Yemenite Jews, for example, and the Jews of Dagestan. The first are Oriental in type while the second belong to the Mongol race. There are black Jews in India, Ethiopian Jews, Phalasha, troglodyte Jews in Africa. However, this fundamental difference which exists, for example, between the Jews of Dagestan and the Yemenite Jews, does not exhaust the question. Actually 9/10 of today's Jews are inhabitants of Eastern Europe or descendants of Jews from this area. Is there a European Oriental Jewish race? Here is how the anti-Semitic theoretician, Hans Gunther, answers this question. Eastern Judaism, which comprised close to 9/10 of the Jews, consisting today of the Jews of Russia, Poland, Galicia, Hungary, Austria, and Germany, as well as the largest part of the Jews in North America and a large part of Western European Jewry, constitutes a racial mixture which we may designate as Western Asiatic, Oriental, East Baltic, Eastern Central Asiatic, Nordic Hamitic Negroid. According to research undertaken in New York, of 4,235 Jews there were brunette-type Jews 52.62%, brunette-type Jewesses 56.94%, blonde-type Jews 10.42%, blonde-type Jewesses 10.27%, mixed-type Jew 36.96%, mixed-type Jewesses 32.79%. 14.25% of Jews and 12.7% of Jewesses had what is called the Jewish nose, which is nothing else but the nose common to the peoples of Asia Minor, especially widespread among the Armenians. This nose is also common among the Mediterranean peoples as well as among the Bavarians, Dinaric race. These few observations permit us to see how stupid the concept of the Jewish race is. The Jewish race is a myth. On the other hand, it is correct to say that the Jews constitute a racial mixture that is different from the racial mixtures of most of the European peoples, especially the Slavs and Germans. However, it is not so much the anthropological characteristics of the Jews which distinguish them from other peoples as their physiological, pathological, and, above all, psychological characteristics. It is primarily the economic and social function of Judaism throughout history which explains this phenomenon. For centuries the Jews were the inhabitants of cities, occupied in trade. The Jewish type is far more the result of this secular function than a racial characteristic. The Jews have absorbed a mass of heterogeneous racial elements, but all these elements have been subjected to the influence of the special conditions in which the Jews lived, which, in the long run, ended up with the creation of the so-called Jewish type. This is the result of a long selection, not racial but economic and social. The physical weakness, the frequency of certain illnesses like diabetes, nervous disorders, a specific body posture, etc., are not racial characteristics but are the result of a specific social position. Nothing is more ridiculous than to explain, for example, the Jews' penchant for trade or their tendency to abstract thinking on the basis of their race. Wherever the Jews are assimilated economically, wherever they cease to form a class, they rapidly lose all these characteristics. And so it happens that where the race's theoreticians thought they were face to face with a genuine race, they were in reality only viewing a human community, whose specific characteristics are above all the result of the social conditions in which it lived for many centuries. A change in these social conditions must naturally bring with it the disappearance of the racial characteristics of Judaism. Zionism. Zionism was born in the light of the incendiary fires of the Russian pogroms of 1882 and in the tumult of the Dreyfus Affair, two events which express the sharpness that the Jewish problem began to assume at the end of the 19th century. The rapid capitalist development of Russian economy after the reform of 1863 made the situation of the Jewish masses in the small towns untenable. In the West, the middle classes, shattered by capitalist concentration, began to turn against the Jewish element whose competition aggravated their situation. In Russia, the Association of the Lovers of Zion was founded. Leo Pinsker wrote Auto-Emancipation, in which he called for a return to Palestine as the sole possible solution of the Jewish question. In Paris, Baron Rothschild, who like all the Jewish magnates viewed with very little favor the mass arrival of Jewish immigrants in the Western countries, became interested in Jewish colonization in Palestine. To help their unfortunate brothers to return to the land of their ancestors, that is to say, to go as far away as possible, contained nothing displeasing to the Jewish bourgeoisie of the West, who with reason feared the rise of anti-Semitism. A short while after the publication of Leo Pinsker's book, a Jewish journalist of Budapest, Theodor Herzl, saw anti-Semitic demonstrations at Paris provoked by the Dreyfus Affair. Soon he wrote The Jewish State, which to this day remains the Bible of the Zionist movement. From its inception, Zionism appeared as a reaction of the Jewish petty bourgeoisie, which still forms the core of Judaism, hard hit by the mounting anti-Semitic wave, kicked from one country to another, and striving to attain the promised land where it might find shelter from the tempests sweeping the modern world. Zionism is thus a very young movement. It is the youngest of the European national movements. That does not prevent it from pretending, even more than all other nationalism, that it draws its substance from a far distant past. Whereas Zionism is in fact the product of the last phase of capitalism beginning to decay, it pretends to draw its origin from a past more than 2,000 years old. Whereas Zionism is essentially a reaction against the situation created for Judaism by the combination of the destruction of feudalism and the decay of capitalism, it affirms that it constitutes a reaction against the state of things existing since the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Christian era. Its recent birth is naturally the best reply to these pretensions. As a matter of fact, how can one believe that the remedy for an evil existing for 2,000 years was discovered only at the end of the 19th century? But like all nationalisms, and even more intensely, Zionism views the historic past in the light of the present. In this way, too, it distorts the present-day picture. Just as France is represented to French children as existing since the Gaul of Vercingetorix, just as the children of Provence are told that the victories that the kings of Ile de France won over their ancestors were their own successes, in the same way Zionism tries to create the myth of an eternal Judaism, eternally the prey of the same persecutions. Zionism sees in the fall of Jerusalem the cause of the dispersion, and consequently, the fountainhead of all Jewish misfortunes of the past, present, and future. The source of all the misfortunes of the Jewish people is the loss of its historic country and its dispersion in all countries, declares the Marxist delegation of the Pole Zion to the Dutch Scandinavian Committee. After the violent dispersion of the Jews by the Romans, their tragic history continues. Driven out of their country, the Jews did not wish, O beauty of free will, to assimilate. Imbued with their national cohesiveness, with a superior ethical feeling, and with an indestructible belief in a single God, see the article of Benadir on anti-Semitism in the General Encyclopedia, they have resisted all attempts at assimilation. Their sole hope during these somber days which lasted 2,000 years has been the vision of a return to their ancient country. Zionism has never seriously posed this question: why, during these 2,000 years, have not the Jews really tried to return to this country? Why was it necessary to wait until the end of the 19th century for a Herzl to succeed in convincing them of this necessity? Why were all the predecessors of Herzl, like the famous Sabbatai Ze'evi, treated as false messiahs? Why were the adherents of Sabbatai Ze'evi fiercely persecuted by Orthodox Judaism? Naturally, in replying to these interesting questions, refuge is sought behind religion. As long as the masses believed that they had to remain in the diaspora until the advent of the Messiah, they had to suffer in silence, states Zitlovsky, whose Zionism is moreover quite conditional. Nevertheless, this explanation tells us nothing. What is required is precisely an answer to the question of why the Jewish masses believed that they had to await the Messiah in order to be able to return to their country. Religion being an ideological reflection of social interests, it must perforce correspond to them. Today religion does not at all constitute an obstacle to Zionism. In reality, just so long as Judaism was incorporated in the feudal system, the dream of Zion was nothing but a dream and did not correspond to any real interest of Judaism. The Jewish tavern owner or farmer of 16th-century Poland thought as little of returning to Palestine as does the Jewish millionaire in America today. Jewish religious messianism was no whit different from the messianism belonging to other religions. Jewish pilgrims who went to Palestine met Catholic, Orthodox, and Muslim pilgrims. Besides, it was not so much the return to Palestine which constituted the foundation of this messianism as the belief in the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem. All of these idealist conceptions of Zionism are naturally inseparable from the dogma of eternal anti-Semitism. As long as the Jews will live in the diaspora, they will be hated by the natives. This essential point of view for Zionism, its spinal column so to speak, is naturally given different nuances by its various currents. Zionism transposes modern anti-Semitism to all of history. It saves itself the trouble of studying the various forms of anti-Semitism and their evolution. However, we have seen that in different historical periods, Judaism made up part of the possessing classes and was treated as such. To sum up, the idealist conception, The sources of Zionism must be sought in the impossibility of assimilation because of eternal antisemitism and of the will to safeguard the treasures of Judaism. In reality, Zionist ideology, like all ideologies, is only the distorted reflection of the interests of a class. It is the ideology of the Jewish petty bourgeoisie, suffocating between feudalism in ruins and capitalism in decay. The refutation of the ideological fantasies of Zionism does not naturally refute the real needs which brought them into being. It is modern antisemitism, and not mythical eternal antisemitism, which is the best agitator in favor of Zionism. Similarly, the basic question to determine is, to what extent is Zionism capable of resolving not the eternal Jewish problem but the Jewish question in the period of capitalist decay? Zionist theoreticians like to compare Zionism with all other national movements. But in reality, the foundations of the national movements and that of Zionism are altogether different. The national movement of the European bourgeoisie is the consequence of capitalist development. It reflects the will of the bourgeoisie to create the national basis for production, to abolish feudal remnants. The national movement of the European bourgeoisie is closely linked with the ascending phase of capitalism. But in the 19th century, in the period of the flowering of nationalisms, far from being Zionist, the Jewish bourgeoisie was profoundly assimilationist. The economic process from which the modern nations issued laid the foundations for integration of the Jewish bourgeoisie into the bourgeois nation. It is only when the process of the formation of nations approaches its end, when the productive forces have for a long time found themselves constricted within national boundaries, that the process of expulsion of Jews from capitalist society begins to manifest itself, that modern antisemitism begins to develop. The elimination of Judaism accompanies the decline of capitalism. Far from being a product of the development of the productive forces, Zionism is precisely the consequence of the complete halt of this development, the result of the petrifaction of capitalism. Whereas the national movement is the product of the ascending period of capitalism, Zionism is the product of the imperialist era. The Jewish tragedy of the 20th century is a direct consequence of the decline of capitalism. Therein lies the principal obstacle to the realization of Zionism. Capitalist decay, basis for the growth of Zionism, is also the cause of the impossibility of its realization. The Jewish bourgeoisie is compelled to create a national state, to assure itself of the objective framework for the development of its productive forces, precisely in the period when the conditions for such a development have long since disappeared. The conditions of the decline of capitalism which have posed so sharply the Jewish question make its solution equally impossible along the Zionist road. And there is nothing astonishing in that. An evil cannot be suppressed without destroying its causes. But Zionism wishes to resolve the Jewish question without destroying capitalism, which is the principal source of the suffering of the Jews. At the end of the 19th century, in the period when the Jewish problem was just beginning to be posed in all its sharpness, 150,000 Jews each year left their countries of origin. Between 1881 and 1925, nearly 4 million Jews emigrated. Despite these enormous figures, the Jewish population of Eastern Europe rose from 6 to 8 million. Thus, even when capitalism was still developing, even when the countries across the ocean were still receiving immigrants, the Jewish question could not even begin to be resolved. In the Zionist sense, far from diminishing, the Jewish population showed a bad penchant of wanting to grow. In order to begin to resolve the Jewish question, that is to say, in order to begin really to transplant the Jewish masses, it would be necessary for the countries of immigration to absorb at least a little more than the natural growth of Jews in the diaspora, that is at least 300,000 Jews per year. And if such a figure could not be reached before the First Imperialist War, when all the conditions were still favorable for emigration, when all developed countries such as the United States were permitting the mass entry of immigrants, then how can we think that it is possible in the period of the continuous crisis of capitalism, in the period of almost incessant wars? Naturally, there are enough ships in the world to transport hundreds of thousands, even millions of Jews. But if all countries have closed their doors to immigrants, it is because there is an overproduction of labor forces just as there is an overproduction of commodities. Contrary to Malthus, who believed that there would be too many people because there would be too few goods, it is precisely the abundance of goods which is the cause of the plethora of human beings. By what miracle, in a period when the world markets are saturated with goods, in a period when unemployment has everywhere become a permanent fixture, by what miracle can a country, however great and rich it may be, we pass over the data relating to poor and small Palestine, develop its productive forces to the point of being able to welcome 300,000 immigrants each year? In reality, the possibilities for Jewish emigration diminish at the same time that the need for it increases. The causes which promote the need for emigration are the same as those which prevent its realization. They all spring from the decline of capitalism. It is from this fundamental contradiction between the necessity for and the possibility of emigration that the political difficulties of Zionism flow. The period of development of the European nations was also the period of an intensive colonization in the countries across the ocean. It was at the beginning and middle of the 19th century, in the golden age of European nationalism, that North America was colonized. It was also in this period that South America and Australia began to be developed. Vast areas of the earth were practically without a master and lent themselves marvelously to the establishment of millions of European emigrants. In that period, for reasons that we have studied, the Jews gave almost no thought to emigrating. Today the whole world is colonized, industrialized, and divided among the various imperialisms. Everywhere Jewish emigrants come into collision at one and the same time with the nationalism of the natives and with the ruling imperialism. In Palestine, Jewish nationalism collides with an increasingly aggressive Arab nationalism. The development of Palestine by Jewish immigration tends to increase the intensity of this Arab nationalism. The economic development of the country results in the growth of the Arab population, its social differentiation, the growth of a national capitalism. To overcome Arab resistance, the Jews need English imperialism. But its support is as harmful as is Arab resistance. English imperialism views with a favorable eye a weak Jewish immigration to constitute a counterweight to the Arab factor, but it is intensely hostile to the establishment of a big Jewish population in Palestine, to its industrial development, to the growth of its proletariat. It merely uses the Jews as a counterweight to the Arab threat, but does everything to raise difficulties for Jewish immigration. Thus, to the increasing difficulties flowing from Arab resistance, there is added the perfidious game of British imperialism. Finally, we must draw still one more conclusion from the fundamental premises which have been established. Because of its necessarily artificial character, because of the slim perspectives for a rapid and normal development of Palestinian economy in our period, the task of Zionist colonization requires considerable capital. Zionism demands incessantly increasing sacrifices from the Jewish communities of the world. But so long as the situation of the Jews is more or less bearable in the diaspora, no Jewish class feels the necessity of making these sacrifices. To the extent that the Jewish masses feel the necessity of having a country, to the extent also that persecutions mount in intensity, so much the less are the Jewish masses able to contribute to Zionist construction. A strong Jewish people in the diaspora is necessary for Palestinian reconstruction, states Ruppin. But so long as the Jewish people is strong in the diaspora, it feels no need for Palestinian reconstruction. When it strongly feels this necessity, the possibility for realizing it no longer exists. It would be difficult today to ask European Jews, who have a pressing need to emigrate, to give aid for the rebuilding of Palestine. The day when they will be able to do it, it is a safe assumption that their enthusiasm for this task will have considerably cooled. A relative success for Zionism, along the lines of creating a Jewish majority in Palestine and even of the formation of a Jewish state, that is to say, a state placed under the complete domination of English or American imperialism, cannot, naturally, be excluded. This would in some ways be a return to the state of things which existed in Palestine before the destruction of Jerusalem and, from this point of view, there will be reparation of a 2,000-year-old injustice. But this tiny independent Jewish state in the midst of a worldwide diaspora will be only an apparent return to the state of things before the year 70. It will not even be the beginning of the solution of the Jewish question. The Jewish diaspora of the Roman era was in effect based on solid economic ground. The Jews played an important economic role in the world. The existence or absence of a Palestinian mother country had for the Jews of this period only a secondary importance. Today it is not a question of giving the Jews a political or spiritual center, as Akadham would have it. It is a question of saving Judaism from the annihilation which threatens it in the diaspora. But in what way will the existence of a small Jewish state in Palestine change anything in the situation of the Polish or German Jews? Admitting even that all the Jews in the world were today Palestinian citizens, would the policy of Hitler have been any different? One must be stricken with an incurable juridical cretinism to believe that the creation of a small Jewish state in Palestine can change anything at all in the situation of the Jews throughout the world, especially in the present period. The situation after the eventual creation of a Jewish state in Palestine will resemble the state of things that existed in the Roman era, only in the fact that in both cases the existence of a small Jewish state in Palestine could in no way influence the situation of the Jews in the diaspora. In the Roman era, the economic and social position of Judaism in the diaspora was very strong, so that the disappearance of this Jewish state did not in any way compromise it. Today the situation of the Jews in the world is very bad, so the re-establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine cannot in any way restore it. In both cases the situation of the Jews does not at all depend on the existence of a state in Palestine but is a function of the general economic, social, and political situation. Even supposing that the Zionist dream is realized and the secular injustice is undone, and we are still very far from that, the situation of Judaism throughout the world will in no way be modified by that. The temple will perhaps be rebuilt but the faithful will continue to suffer. The history of Zionism is the best illustration of the insurmountable difficulties that it encounters, difficulties resulting, in the last analysis, from the fundamental contradiction which tears it apart, the contradiction between the growing necessity of resolving the Jewish question and the growing impossibility of resolving it under the conditions of decaying capitalism. Immediately following the First Imperialist War, Jewish emigration to Palestine encountered no great obstacles in its path. Despite that, there were relatively few immigrants. The economic conditions of capitalist countries after the war made the need to emigrate less pressing. It was, moreover, because of this light emigration that the British movement did not feel obliged to set up bars to the entry of Jews into Palestine. In the years 1924, 1925, 1926, the Polish bourgeoisie opened an economic offensive against the Jewish masses. These years are also the period of a very important immigration into Palestine. But this massive immigration soon collided with insurmountable economic difficulties. The ebb was almost as great as was the flood tide. Up to 1933, the date of Hitler's arrival to power, immigration was of little importance. After this date, tens of thousands of Jews began to arrive in Palestine. But this conjuncture was soon arrested by a storm of anti-Jewish demonstrations and massacres. The Arabs seriously feared becoming a minority in the country. The Arab feudal elements feared being submerged by the capitalist wave. British imperialism profited from this tension by piling up obstacles to the entry of the Jews, by working to deepen the gulf existing between the Jews and the Arabs, by proposing the partition of Palestine. Up to the Second Imperialist War, Zionism thus found itself in the grip of mounting difficulties. The Palestinian population lived in a state of permanent terror. Precisely when the situation of the Jews became ever more desperate, Zionism showed itself absolutely incapable of providing a remedy. Illegal Jewish immigrants were greeted with rifle fire by their British protectors. The Zionist illusion began to lose its attractiveness even in the eyes of the most uninformed. In Poland, the last elections revealed that the Jewish masses were turning completely away from Zionism. The Jewish masses began to understand that Zionism not only could not seriously improve their situation, but that it was furnishing weapons to the anti-Semites by its theories of the objective necessity of Jewish emigration. The imperialist war and the triumph of Hitlerism in Europe are an unprecedented disaster for Judaism. Judaism is confronted with the threat of total extinction. What can Zionism do to counteract such a disaster? Is it not obvious that the Jewish question is very little dependent upon the future destiny of Tel Aviv but very greatly upon the regime which will be set up tomorrow in Europe and in the world? The Zionists have a great deal of faith in a victory of Anglo-American imperialism. But is there a single reason for believing that the attitude of the Anglo-American imperialists will differ after their eventual victory from their pre-war attitude? It is obvious that there is none. Even admitting that Anglo-American imperialism will create some kind of abortive Jewish state, we have seen that the situation of world Judaism will hardly be affected. A great Jewish immigration into Palestine after this war will confront the same difficulties as previously. Under conditions of capitalist decay, it is impossible to transplant millions of Jews. Only a worldwide socialist planned economy would be capable of such a miracle. Naturally, this presupposes the proletarian revolution. But Zionism wishes precisely to resolve the Jewish question independently of the world revolution. By misconstruing the real sources of the Jewish question in our period, by lulling itself with puerile dreams and silly hopes, Zionism proves that it is an ideological excrescence and not a scientific doctrine. toward a solution of the Jewish question. It is incorrect to state that a solution for the Jewish problem has been needed for 2,000 years. The very fact that in the course of this long period such a solution was not found best demonstrates that it was not necessary. Judaism was an indispensable factor in pre-capitalist society. It was a fundamental organism within it. That is what explains the 2,000-year existence of Judaism in the diaspora. The Jew is as characteristic a personage in feudal society as the lord and the serf. It was no accident that a foreign element played the role of capital in feudal society. Feudal society as such could not create a capitalist element. As soon as it was able to do so, precisely then it ceased being feudal. Nor was it accidental that the Jew remained a foreigner in the midst of feudal society. The capital of pre-capitalist society existed outside of its economic system. From the moment that capital begins to emerge from the womb of this social system and takes the place of the borrowed organ, the Jew is eliminated and feudal society ceases to be feudal. It is modern capitalism that has posed the Jewish problem. Not because the Jews today number close to 20 million people, the proportion of Jews to non-Jews has declined greatly since the Roman era, but because capitalism destroyed the secular basis for the existence of Judaism. Capitalism destroyed feudal society, and with it the function of the Jewish people class. History doomed this people class to disappearance, and thus the Jewish problem arose. The Jewish problem is the problem of adapting Judaism to modern society, of liquidating the heritage bequeathed to humanity by feudalism. For centuries Judaism was a social organism within which social and national elements were closely intermingled. The Jews are far from constituting a race, on the contrary, they are probably one of the most typical and conspicuous examples of racial mixture. This does not mean, however, that the Asiatic element is not very noticeable in the mixture, sufficiently outstanding, in any case, to set the Jew apart in the Western nations, where he is chiefly to be found. This real national base is supplemented by an imaginary, poetic base, formed out of the secular tradition which attaches the present Jew to his distant ancestors of biblical times. On this national base, the class foundation and the mercantile psychology were subsequently grafted. The national and social elements became mixed to the point of complete intermingling. It would be difficult to distinguish in a Polish Jew the part that his type has inherited from his ancestors and the part acquired from the social function that he fulfilled in that country for centuries. It must be agreed that the social base long ago acquired greater importance than the national base. At any rate, if the social element came to be added to the national element, the latter could persist only thanks to the former. It is thanks to his social and economic situation that the Jew was able to preserve himself. Capitalism has posed the Jewish problem, that is to say, it has destroyed the social basis upon which Judaism maintained itself for centuries. But capitalism has not resolved the Jewish problem, for it has been unable to absorb the Jew liberated from his social shell. The decline of capitalism has suspended the Jews between heaven and earth. The Jewish pre-capitalist merchant has largely disappeared, but his son has found no place in modern production. The social basis of Judaism has crumbled. Judaism has become largely a declassed element. Capitalism has not only doomed the social function of the Jews, it has also doomed the Jews themselves. Petty bourgeois ideologists are always inclined to raise a historical phenomenon into an eternal category. For them the Jewish question is a function of the diaspora, only the concentration of the Jews in Palestine can resolve it. But it is pure childishness to reduce the Jewish question to a question of territory. The territorial solution has meaning only if it signifies the disappearance of traditional Judaism, the penetration of Jews into modern economy, the productivization of the Jews. By a detour, Zionism thus returns to the solution proposed by its worst enemies, the consistent assimilationists. For the Zionists as well as for the assimilationists it is a question of doing away with the cursed heritage of the past, of making workers, agriculturists, productive intellectuals, of the Jews. The illusion of Zionism does not consist in its desire to attain this result, that is a historical necessity which will cut its own path sooner or later. Its illusion consists in believing that the insurmountable difficulties which decaying capitalism puts in the way of these tasks will disappear as if by magic in Palestine. But if the Jews were unable to find a place in economic life in the diaspora, the same causes will prevent them from doing so in Palestine. The world today is so much a unit that it is sheer folly to try to build within it a haven sheltered from its storms. That is why the failure of assimilation must of necessity be followed by the failure of Zionism. In this period when the Jewish problem takes on the aspect of a terrible tragedy, Palestine can be no more than a feeble palliative. 10 million Jews find themselves in a huge concentration camp. What remedy can the creation of a few Zionist colonies bring to this problem? Well then, neither assimilation nor Zionism? No solution at all? No, there is no solution to the Jewish question under capitalism, just as there is no solution to the other problems posed before humanity, without profound social upheavals. The same causes which make the emancipation of the Jews an illusion also make the realization of Zionism impossible. Unless the profound causes for the Jewish question are eliminated, the effects cannot be eliminated. The ghetto and the wheel, the badge that Jews sewed on their clothes in the Middle Ages, have reappeared, symbols, moreover, of the tragic destiny toward which humanity is being driven. But the very exacerbation of anti-Semitism prepares the road for its disappearance. The driving out of the Jews provides momentarily a kind of living space for the petty bourgeoisie. Aryanization creates jobs for some tens of thousands of unemployed intellectuals and petty bourgeois. But in attacking the apparent causes of their misfortunes, the petty bourgeoisie has merely strengthened the operation of the real causes. Fascism will accelerate the process of proletarianization of the middle classes. After the Jewish petty bourgeoisie, hundreds of thousands of shopkeepers and artisans were expropriated and proletarianized. Capitalist concentration made gigantic progress. Improvement in the economic situation took place only at the price of preparation for the Second Imperialist War, the cause of enormous destruction and slaughter. Thus the tragic fate of Judaism mirrors with singular sharpness the situation of all humanity. The decline of capitalism means for the Jews the return to the ghetto, although the basis for the ghetto disappeared long ago, along with the foundations of feudal society. Similarly, for all humanity capitalism bars the road of the past as well as the highway to the future. Only the destruction of capitalism will make it possible for humanity to benefit from the immense achievements of the industrial era. Is it astonishing that the Jewish masses, who are the first to feel, and with special sharpness, the effects of the contradictions of capitalism, should have furnished rich forces for the socialist and revolutionary struggle? On various occasions Lenin emphasized the importance of the Jews for the revolution, not only in Russia but in other countries as well. Lenin also expressed the thought that the flight of a part of the Jewish population into the interior of Russia, as a result of the occupation of the industrial regions of the West, had been a very useful thing for the revolution, just as the appearance of a large number of Jewish intellectuals in the Russian cities during the war had also been useful. They helped to smash the widespread and extremely dangerous sabotage which confronted the Bolsheviks everywhere immediately following the revolution. Thus they helped the revolution to survive a very critical stage. The high percentage of Jews in the proletarian movement is only a reflection of the tragic situation of Judaism in our time. The intellectual faculties of the Jews, fruit of the historic past of Judaism, are thus an important support for the proletarian movement. In this latter fact lies a final, and not the least important, reason for modern anti-Semitism. The ruling classes persecute with special sadism the Jewish intellectuals and workers, who have supplied a host of fighters to the revolutionary movement. To isolate the Jews completely from the sources of culture and science has become a vital necessity for the decaying system which persecutes them. The ridiculous legend of Jewish Marxism is nothing but a caricature of the bonds that actually exist between socialism and the Jewish masses. Never has the situation of the Jews been so tragic. In the worst periods of the Middle Ages, entire countries opened their doors to receive them. Today capitalism, which rules the whole world, makes the earth uninhabitable for them. Never has the mirage of a promised land so haunted the Jewish masses. But never was a promised land less capable of resolving the Jewish question than in our time. The very paroxysm, however, that the Jewish problem has reached today, also provides the key to its solution. The plight of the Jews has never been so tragic, but never has it been so close to ceasing to be that. In past centuries, hatred of the Jews had a real basis in the social antagonism which set them against other classes of the population. Today, the interests of the Jewish classes are closely bound up with the interests of the popular masses of the entire world. By persecuting the Jews as capitalism makes them complete pariahs. The ferocious persecutions against Judaism render stark naked the stupid bestiality of antisemitism and destroy the remnants of prejudices that the working classes nurse against the Jews. The ghettos and the yellow badges do not prevent the workers from feeling a growing solidarity with those who suffer most from the afflictions all humanity is suffering. And the greatest social explosion the world has ever seen is finally preparing the liberation of the most persecuted pariahs of our planet. When the people of the factories and the fields have finally thrown off the yoke of the capitalists, When a future of unlimited development opens up before liberated humanity, the Jewish masses will be able to make a far from unimportant contribution towards the building of a new world. This does not mean that socialism, brought to maturity by a wave of a magic wand, will remove all the difficulties that stand as obstacles to the solution of the Jewish question. The example of the USSR shows that even after the proletarian revolution, the special structure of Judaism, a heritage of history, will give rise to a number of difficulties, particularly during the transition periods. During the time of the NEP, for instance, the Jews of Russia, utilizing their traditional business experience, furnished numerous cadres for the new bourgeois class. Moreover, the great mass of Jewish small tradesmen and petty artisans suffered greatly at the beginning of the proletarian dictatorship. It was only later, with the success of the 5-year plan, that the Jews penetrated en masse into Soviet economic life. Despite certain difficulties, the experiment was decisive. Hundreds of thousands of Jews became workers and peasants. The fact that white-collar workers and functionaries constitute a considerable percentage of wage-earning Jews must not be considered a matter for concern. Socialism is not at all interested that all Jews should take up manual occupations. On the contrary, the intellectual faculties of the Jews should be put to widest use. It is thus clear that, even under the relatively difficult conditions of a backward country, the proletariat can solve the Jewish problem. The Jews have penetrated en masse into Russian economy. The productivization of the Jews has been accompanied by two parallel processes, assimilation and territorial concentration. Wherever the Jews penetrate into industry, they are rapidly assimilated. As early as 1926 there were hardly 40% of the Jewish miners in the Donetsk basin who spoke Yiddish. Nevertheless, the Jews live under a regime of national autonomy. They have special schools, a Yiddish press, autonomous courts. But the Jewish nationalists are continually deploring the abandonment of these schools and this press. Only in those places where fairly dense masses of Jews have been colonized, especially in Azerbaijan, do we witness a kind of national renaissance. Thus life itself demonstrates that the problem which so bitterly divides Judaism, assimilation or territorial concentration, is a fundamental problem only to petty bourgeois dreamers. The Jewish masses want simply an end to their martyrdom. That, socialism alone can give them. But socialism must give the Jews, as it will to all peoples, the possibility of assimilation as well as the possibility of having a special national life. The end of Judaism? Certainly. Despite their apparently irreconcilable opposition, assimilationists and nationalists are agreed in combating Judaism as history has known it, the mercantile Judaism of the diaspora, the people class. The Zionists never stop repeating that it is a matter of creating a new type of Jew in Palestine, altogether different from the Jew of the diaspora. They even reject with horror the language and culture of the Judaism of the diaspora. In Azerbaijan, in the Ukraine and the Donetsk basin, even the old man discards his secular dress. The people class, historical Judaism, has been definitively doomed by history. Despite all its traditional pretensions, Zionism will not culminate in a national renaissance but, at the most, in a national birth. The new Jew resembles neither his brother of the diaspora nor his ancestor of the era of the fall of Jerusalem. The young Palestinian, proud of speaking the language of Bar Kokhba, would probably not be understood by his ancestor. In reality, the Jews in the Roman era spoke Aramaic and Greek fluently but had only a vague knowledge of Hebrew. Moreover, Neo-Hebrew, in the nature of things, is going further and further away from the language of the Bible. Everything will add up to estrange the Palestinian Jew from the Judaism of the diaspora. And tomorrow, when national barriers and prejudices begin to disappear in Palestine, who can doubt that a fruitful reconciliation will take place between the Arab and the Jewish workers, the result of which will be their partial or total fusion. Eternal Judaism, which, moreover, has never been anything but a myth, will disappear. It is puerile to pose assimilation and the national solution as opposites. Even in those countries where Jewish national communities will eventually be created, we will be witnessing either the creation of a new Jewish nationality, completely different from the old, or the formation of new nations. Moreover, even in the first case, unless the people already established in the country are driven out or the rigorous prescriptions of Ezra and Nehemiah are revived, this new nationality cannot fail to come under the influence of the long-time inhabitants of the country. In the sphere of nationality, only socialism can bring the widest democracy. It must provide the Jews with the opportunity of living a national existence in every country they inhabit. It must also give them the opportunity of concentrating in one or more territories, naturally without injuring the interests of the native inhabitants. Only the widest proletarian democracy will make possible the resolution of the Jewish problem with a minimum of suffering. Clearly, the tempo of the solution of the Jewish problem depends upon the general tempo of socialist construction. The opposition between assimilation and the national solution is an entirely relative one, the latter often being nothing but the prelude to the former. Historically, all existing nations are the products of various fusions of races and peoples. It is not excluded that new nations, fanned by the fusion or even the dispersion of nations now existing, will be created. However it may be, socialism must limit itself in this sphere to letting nature take its course. Thus in a certain sense socialism will return to the practice of pre-capitalist society. It was capitalism by virtue of the fact that it provided an economic basis for the national problem, which also created insoluble national contradictions. Before the capitalist era, Slovaks, Czechs, Germans, French, lived in perfect understanding. Wars did not have a national character, they had interest only for the possessing classes. The policy of compulsory assimilation, of national persecution, was unknown to the Romans. Submission of barbarian peoples to Romanization or Hellenization was a peaceful process. Today, national cultural and linguistic antagonisms are only manifestations of the economic antagonism created by capitalism. With the disappearance of capitalism, the national problem will lose all its acuteness. If it is premature to speak of a worldwide assimilation of peoples, it is nonetheless clear that a planned economy on a global scale will bring all the peoples of the world much closer to each other. But the hastening of this assimilation by artificial means would hardly seem to be indicated. Nothing could do more harm. We still cannot foresee exactly what the offspring of present Judaism will be. Socialism will take care that the birth will take place under the best possible conditions.